Hello, and welcome back to Sleepy History 5.00. Tonight, we are stepping into a world that was far less tidy, far less predictable, and much more strange than most history books would have you believe. We are going to explore how people in the Middle Ages encountered intoxicating plants, mysterious fungi, powerful medicines, strange drinks, and substances that could blur the line between healing and hallucination. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely enjoy these slow, relaxing historical journeys. And if you feel like it, tell us in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Somewhere across the world, another person may be lying quietly in bed, listening to the same story at this very moment. Now, let your shoulders relax. Take a slow breath. Let the room become quiet around you. And as you settle in, imagine medieval Europe. There are no electric lights glowing in the windows, no supermarkets, pharmacies, or neatly labeled bottles. Instead, there are stone houses, wooden cottages, monastery gardens, smoky kitchens, crowded markets, and forests filled with plants whose effects were only partly understood. For medieval people, nature was both pharmacy and mystery. A plant could ease a toothache. Another could help someone sleep. Another might produce strange dreams, and another could quietly kill. The difference between medicine and poison was often little more than preparation, quantity, and luck. People knew this, even if they did not understand the chemistry behind it. Physicians studied herbs. Monks copied recipes into manuscripts. Midwives passed knowledge from one generation to another. Herbalists gathered roots and flowers in forests and fields. And ordinary people experimented too, sometimes carefully, sometimes desperately, and sometimes simply because someone had heard that a particular plant could make the world feel different. There was no modern language for recreational intoxication. Instead, people spoke of visions, sleep, healing, prophecy, spiritual experiences, or mysterious states of mind. And so, beneath the familiar medieval world of castles, churches, farms, and battlefields, another world existed quietly. A world of roots, wines, mushrooms, smoke, herbs, and dreams. Tonight, we're going to enter that world slowly. And perhaps, by the end, the Middle Ages will seem a little stranger than they did before. As the night deepens, imagine yourself walking beyond the village. The road is narrow, the ground uneven, and the darkness almost complete. Somewhere nearby, an owl calls from the trees. Behind you, a few candlelit windows glow faintly through the mist. You're looking for a herbalist. In the medieval world, such a person might know more about plants than most villagers ever could. Their knowledge was practical, passed from one generation to another, often through observation rather than formal schooling. They knew which leaves could be placed on a wound, which roots could calm a stomach, which flowers might help someone sleep, and which plants were best left untouched. One of the most famous was henbane. Its name may sound harmless, but medieval people who understood it knew that this was a plant to treat with considerable caution. In small, carefully prepared amounts, henbane could act as a sedative and pain reliever. It could be used for toothaches, sleeplessness, and certain forms of discomfort. But the distance between a useful dose and a dangerous one could be frighteningly small. Too much could bring confusion, delirium, blurred vision, agitation, and hallucinations. A person might see things that were not there. They might become convinced that ordinary objects were alive. They might wander through the night without understanding where they were going. And because medieval physicians did not have modern laboratory equipment, controlling the exact concentration of an herbal preparation was difficult. A recipe that worked for one person might be disastrous for another. Henbane was not unique. The medieval herbal cabinet contained many plants capable of altering consciousness. Some were used intentionally. Others were encountered accidentally. And some became surrounded by stories so strange that it became difficult to separate botanical knowledge from folklore. Perhaps the strangest example was the mandrake. Its roots sometimes grew in shapes that vaguely resembled a human body. That resemblance fascinated medieval people. Stories developed around it. claiming that the mandrake possessed magical powers and that pulling it from the earth could produce a deadly scream. Naturally, harvesting such a plant became a dangerous business. Legend said that a dog could be tied to the root and used to pull it from the ground while the harvester stood safely away. Whether anyone actually followed this method exactly as described is another question, but the story tells us something important. Medieval people did not see plants as simple objects. A root could be medicine. It could be a symbol. It could become part of a legend. And sometimes it could become all three at once. As you continue walking through the quiet medieval landscape, the herbalist's garden begins to disappear behind you. Ahead, another plant waits in the darkness. One with a much more beautiful name, Deadly Nightshade. Deadly Nightshade sounds like something invented for a dark fairy tale, but the plant was very real. Its scientific name is Atropa belladonna, and throughout European history, it developed a reputation that was both fascinating and frightening. The berries were dark and tempting. The plant could also be dangerous. Its name, belladonna, is often translated as beautiful lady, a name connected with the plant's historical use in cosmetics. Extracts were sometimes used to enlarge the pupils of the eyes, creating a fashionable appearance among certain women. But beauty came with a serious price. The same compounds that affected the eyes could also affect the brain and nervous system. Depending on the amount, exposure could produce dry mouth, blurred vision, confusion, rapid heartbeat, delirium, and hallucinations. In severe cases, poisoning could become fatal. To a modern person, this sounds terrifying. To a medieval healer, however, it was another example of a principle they encountered constantly. A medicine could become a poison if used incorrectly. This was the difficult world of medieval medicine. There were no standardized tablets, no printed warning labels, no precise measuring devices sitting beside the mixing bowl. Instead, preparations might be made from plants gathered in forests and gardens, then dried, crushed, boiled, infused, or mixed with wine, honey, oil, or animal fat. Knowledge mattered, experience mattered, and sometimes luck mattered most of all. Belladonna also became associated with magical practices and stories about witches. This is where the historical record becomes especially complicated. Later writers often described mysterious ointments containing plants such as belladonna, henbane, and mandrake. These stories became closely connected with the famous idea of witches flying through the night. But the reality was probably much less dramatic than the legends. There is evidence that certain psychoactive plants were known and used, but historians continue to debate how commonly so-called flying ointments were actually used, and how much of the later folklore came from accusations rather than first-hand experience. Still, the idea survived. A strange ointment, a dark forest, a wooden broom, and a person convinced that they had left the ordinary world behind. Perhaps that is why the broomstick became such a powerful symbol. The medieval imagination was filled with journeys that did not require roads. Some journeys happened through prayer, some through dreams, some through fever, and some, perhaps, through substances capable of changing perception. But there was another way to alter the mind that was far more ordinary. It did not require a mysterious root. It did not require a secret potion. All you needed was a cup, and something fermented inside it. Wine, ale, beer. For medieval people, alcohol was not some strange underground substance. It was everywhere, and its story is just beginning. For medieval people, alcohol was not simply a way to celebrate. It was part of everyday life. Ale, beer, wine, and cider appeared at meals, festivals, markets, monasteries, and taverns. In many places, fermented drinks were also safer than questionable water sources, making them a practical part of daily life. A weak drink called small beer was common in parts of medieval Europe. It contained relatively little alcohol and could be consumed regularly. But stronger drinks were available too. Wine could be mixed with herbs and spices. Ale could be flavored with different plants. Mead was made from fermented honey and could be surprisingly strong. And then there were the taverns. Imagine entering one on a cold medieval evening. The room is warm and smoky. Wooden cups sit on rough tables. Someone is laughing in the corner. A musician is playing quietly. Travelers are exchanging stories while locals argue about things that probably seemed extremely important at the time. Alcohol helped people forget the cold. It helped celebrations feel larger. It helped dull pain. And sometimes, it simply helped people forget their problems for a few hours. Monasteries became especially important centers of brewing. Monks produced beer and wine for religious, practical, and economic reasons. Some monasteries developed sophisticated brewing traditions and carefully recorded their methods. But alcohol had limits. Too much could turn a peaceful evening into confusion. And medieval people understood that intoxication could lead to embarrassing behavior, violence, accidents, and regret. Still, alcohol was considered ordinary in a way many other intoxicating substances were not. A person drinking ale was usually not viewed as practicing forbidden magic. A person preparing a mysterious potion for belladonna was another matter entirely. And sometimes, intoxication happened without anyone intending it. This brings us to one of the strangest substances in medieval history. It was not brewed deliberately. It was not sold by a herbalist. It could simply appear inside someone's bread. The culprit was a tiny fungus, and its effects could be terrifying. Its name was ergot. Ergot was a fungus that could grow on rye and other cereal grains. To a medieval farmer, infected grain might simply look strange. There was no microscope to reveal what was happening inside it, and there was certainly no modern understanding of fungal toxins. So sometimes the grain was harvested, ground into flour, and baked into bread. And that was when the trouble began. Ergot poisoning, known as ergotism, could produce terrifying symptoms. Some victims experienced burning sensations, muscle spasms, seizures, confusion, and hallucinations. In severe cases, blood vessels could constrict so badly that fingers, toes, or entire limbs lost their blood supply. Imagine an entire village eating the same bread and then, one by one, becoming violently ill. People had no idea what had caused it. They might blame bad air. They might blame divine punishment. They might suspect witchcraft. Or they might simply believe that something supernatural had entered their food. The connection between contaminated grain and illness would remain poorly understood for centuries. One particularly disturbing form of ergotism involved uncontrolled movements and convulsions. Historical accounts of strange episodes of dancing have sometimes been connected with ergot poisoning, although historians still debate exactly what caused particular medieval dancing manias. What is certain is that contaminated food could transform an ordinary meal into a medical disaster. The irony is almost cruel. People sometimes searched for magical plants to change their consciousness. Yet one of the most powerful mind-altering substances could arrive without warning in something as ordinary as a loaf of bread. And there was another curious substance that could produce strange effects. This time, the culprit was not a fungus. It came from flowers. Bees gathered nectar from rhododendron plants in certain mountainous regions, producing a rare substance later known as mad honey. In small quantities, it could cause dizziness and unusual sensations. In larger amounts, it could lead to vomiting, confusion, weakness, and dangerous changes in heart rate. Even the bees, it seemed, could accidentally become part of the medieval pharmacological experiment. And as strange as these stories sound, people were only beginning to discover how many ways nature could alter the human mind. Mad honey was especially associated with the mountainous regions around the Black Sea and Anatolia. Bees gathered nectar from certain rhododendron flowers, and the resulting honey could contain compounds capable of affecting the human nervous system. For someone who knew what they were dealing with, a tiny amount might be used deliberately. For someone who did not, it could become a very unpleasant surprise. Historical writers described soldiers becoming sick after eating honey left along roads or in abandoned settlements. Whether every ancient account was completely accurate is difficult to know, but the danger of rhododendron honey is real. A person might become dizzy, their vision could change, their heart rate could slow, they could become confused or collapse. So once again, something that looked completely harmless could hide a dangerous secret. And this was one of the great difficulties of the medieval world. Nature did not come with labels. A beautiful flower did not announce that it contained a powerful chemical. A dark berry did not explain how much was dangerous. A loaf of bread did not reveal that its grain had been contaminated. Knowledge had to be learned through experience, tradition, and sometimes painful mistakes. This is where medieval herbalists became important. Some are highly respected. Others were little more than traveling healers selling mysterious mixtures. They might carry dried leaves, roots, seeds, oils, powders, and small bottles of herbal preparations. People visited them for headaches, toothaches, wounds, sleeplessness, stomach problems, and pain. Sometimes the treatment probably helped. Sometimes it did nothing. And sometimes it made the situation much worse. Women were particularly important in this world of practical medicine. Midwives and household healers often possessed knowledge passed down through generations. They knew how to prepare certain teas, poultices, oils, and remedies. But their knowledge could also make authorities suspicious. A healer who successfully treated a neighbor might be respected one year and accused of dangerous magic the next. The boundary between medicine and superstition was never perfectly clear. And as night settles deeper over our imaginary medieval village, another question begins to emerge. What happened when people deliberately sought visions? For some, the answer was not medicine. It was spirituality. And that takes us into the mysterious world of dreams, fasting, prayer, incense, and altered states. For many medieval people, strange visions were not automatically considered signs of illness. Sometimes they were believed to have spiritual meaning. Monks, mystics, pilgrims, and deeply religious people spent long periods praying, fasting, and sitting in candlelit churches. Hours could pass in silence. The body became tired. The stomach became empty. The senses became surrounded by darkness, chanting, and the heavy scent of burning incense. Under those conditions, unusual experiences were possible even without deliberately consuming an intoxicating substance. Incense itself was everywhere. Frankincense and myrrh were burned during religious ceremonies, filling churches with fragrant smoke. To medieval Christians, the smoke symbolized prayer rising toward heaven. But inside a poorly ventilated building, breathing smoke for long periods could also make a person feel lightheaded or sleepy. Add fasting, exhaustion, darkness, and intense emotion, and the experience could become powerful. A monk might describe a vision of an angel. Another person might believe they had heard the voice of a saint. Someone else might simply become dizzy and need to sit down. The medieval mind did not separate spirituality, medicine, psychology, and the supernatural in the same way modern people often do. A vision could be a divine message. It could be temptation. It could be illness. It could be a dream. Or it could be something no one could explain. And that uncertainty made altered states fascinating. There were also people who deliberately searched for them. Mystics sometimes practiced extreme fasting, sleep deprivation, isolation, and prolonged prayer in the hope of experiencing a closer connection with God. Their goal was not entertainment. It was transcendence. They wanted to move beyond ordinary awareness. Meanwhile, in other parts of the medieval world, people were experimenting with different substances and traditions. One of the most famous was cannabis resin, commonly known as hashish. Its history reaches far beyond medieval Europe. In regions of the Islamic world, including Persia, Egypt, and parts of the Eastern Mediterranean, cannabis was known and sometimes consumed. Its reputation was complicated. Some people considered it useful. Others condemned it. And certain mystics were said to experiment with it as they searched for unusual states of consciousness. But unlike the terrifying plants of European folklore, hashish belonged to a much broader cultural history. And to understand that history, we need to leave the cold forests of Europe for the warmer cities of the Islamic world. Across the medieval Islamic world, cities such as Cairo, Baghdad, and Damascus became centers of medicine, philosophy, poetry, and scientific study. Cannabis was known in these societies, although attitudes toward it varied greatly. Hashish, made from concentrated cannabis resin, could be consumed in different ways. Some people mixed it with food or sweet substances, while others used it simply for its intoxicating effects. Physicians and writers sometimes described what happened to people who consumed it. The effects could include relaxation, altered perception, laughter, drowsiness, or intense imagination. But religious and legal opinions were far from uniform. Some scholars argued that intoxication itself was the problem, regardless of the substance. Others distinguished between different forms of use. Authorities sometimes attempted to restrict cannabis, especially when they believed it encouraged disorder or excessive behavior. Yet prohibition rarely made the substance disappear. People continued to use it. Sufi mystics became especially associated with stories about hashish. Some accounts describe individuals seeking altered states as part of spiritual contemplation, although it would be misleading to suggest that cannabis was a standard or universal part of Sufi practice. Most spiritual traditions relied on prayer, meditation, discipline, and devotion rather than drugs. Still, cannabis became part of the broader cultural conversation about consciousness. Poets wrote about altered perception. Physicians discussed its effects. Religious scholars debated its acceptability. And ordinary people used it for reasons ranging from curiosity to relaxation. One famous legend even claimed that the mysterious assassins used hashish before carrying out their missions. The story became enormously popular in later European literature. But historians generally regard the idea that the assassins routinely drugged their recruits with hashish as a legend rather than established fact. The truth, as usual, is less dramatic. The medieval world was already complicated enough without needing secret armies of permanently intoxicated assassins. Still, the story reveals something important. Cannabis had become surrounded by mythology, and once a substance acquires a mysterious reputation, stories can become more powerful than facts. Back in Europe, another kind of legend was taking shape. It involved witches. It involved strange ointments. And eventually, it would become connected with one of the most recognizable objects in all of folklore, the broomstick. But the real story behind the flying witch is stranger than the fairy tale. The image of a witch flying through the night on a broomstick is one of the most familiar pictures in European folklore. But the origins of that image are far more complicated. Medieval and early modern writers sometimes described magical ointments that supposedly allowed witches to fly, transform, or experience strange visions. These stories often included plants such as henbane, belladonna, and mandrake. The ointments were usually described as mixtures of herbs combined with animal fat or other substances. But there's an important distinction. The historical evidence does not prove that large numbers of witches regularly used these preparations to fly. Much of what we know comes from theological writings, witch trial records, and later folklore. These sources were often written by people who already believed in witchcraft. So separating actual practice from accusation is extremely difficult. Still, psychoactive plants could produce vivid hallucinations. A person experiencing delirium might genuinely believe they were floating above the ground. They might dream of traveling through the sky. They might see animals, spirits, strangers, or landscapes that felt completely real. And when such experiences were interpreted through medieval beliefs about demons and magic, the story could quickly become supernatural. The broom itself may have added another layer. Some historical accounts describe magical substances being applied to the body rather than swallowed. Certain areas of the skin could absorb chemicals more readily than others. Later writers sometimes connected this practice with household objects such as staffs or broom handles. Over time, the image of the witch and broom became deeply embedded in European culture. But behind the folklore was a very human fascination with altered consciousness. People wanted to understand dreams. They wanted relief from pain. They wanted spiritual experiences. They wanted answers about the future. And sometimes they simply wanted to escape ordinary life for a while. The substances available to them could be remarkably powerful, yet they were also unpredictable. A plant that helped one person sleep might send another into delirium. A potion intended to reduce pain could become poisonous. And a simple loaf of bread could contain a fungus capable of changing an entire village's behavior. The medieval world was full of these contradictions. Medicine could resemble magic. Magic could resemble medicine. And healing could sometimes look disturbingly similar to poisoning. But there was another substance that almost everyone understood. It was warm, familiar, socially accepted, and available in nearly every medieval community. And unlike belladonna or mandrake, nobody needed a mysterious herbalist to obtain it. It was alcohol, and it had become one of the most important intoxicants in medieval life. Alcohol was everywhere in medieval Europe. Ale, beer, wine, and mead were part of ordinary life. People drank at meals, celebrations, religious festivals, markets, and taverns. For many communities, fermented drinks were also practical. Clean drinking water was not always easy to find, especially in crowded towns. Weak ale provided hydration while also containing a small amount of alcohol. But not every medieval drink was weak. Wine could be strong, especially when mixed with herbs and spices. Mead, made from fermented honey, could also produce a noticeable intoxication. And then there were the taverns. Imagine stepping inside one on a cold evening. The room is warm. Smoke hangs near the ceiling. Wooden cups cover rough tables. Travelers talk loudly while musicians play in the corner. People came to taverns to eat, drink, gossip, celebrate, and escape the difficulties of everyday life. Alcohol could make pain easier to tolerate. It could make sadness temporarily quieter, and it could make an ordinary evening feel much more exciting. Monasteries were also important producers of alcoholic drinks. Monks brewed beer and made wine for religious ceremonies, hospitality, and daily use. Over time, some monasteries became famous for their brewing traditions. But medieval people understood that drinking too much could create problems. Arguments became fights. Celebrations became accidents. And a peaceful night could end with someone sleeping on the floor. Still, alcohol was generally viewed very differently from mysterious plants. Drinking ale was normal. Preparing a strange potion was suspicious. The fungus was called ergot. It could grow on rye and other grains, especially under damp conditions. Medieval farmers had no way to see the microscopic organisms responsible, so contaminated grain could easily find its way into flour. Then people ate the bread. Ergot poisoning could produce frightening symptoms. Some victims suffered burning sensations, muscle spasms, confusion, and hallucinations. Severe poisoning could damage blood circulation so badly that fingers, toes, or even limbs began to die. Imagine an entire village becoming sick after sharing the same harvest. People would have searched for an explanation. Perhaps the food was cursed. Perhaps God was angry. Perhaps a witch had poisoned the village. Nobody could simply test the bread in a laboratory. There were also strange episodes of uncontrolled movement, sometimes described in medieval sources as dancing manias. Some researchers have suggested ergot poisoning as one possible explanation, although the causes of these events remain debated. What is certain is that contaminated grain could cause serious outbreaks of illness. And the tragedy was that people often had no idea they were consuming anything unusual. They were simply eating bread. This makes ergot one of the strangest examples in the history of intoxication. Unlike a potion, nobody had prepared it intentionally. Unlike wine, nobody had fermented it for pleasure. It was an accident of agriculture. Nature had slipped something powerful into the food supply, and sometimes the consequences were devastating. Yet medieval people continued experimenting with plants and natural substances because they had few alternatives. Pain was everywhere. Toothaches, injuries, childbirth, surgery, fevers, sleep problems. Modern anesthesia did not exist. Modern painkillers did not exist. So people turned toward the natural world. Some remedies were effective. Others were useless. Some were dangerous. And a few were all three depending on the dose. Among the most mysterious substances were those derived from a poppy. Poppies have been known for their powerful effects since ancient times. Preparations made from them could reduce pain and encourage sleep. Mixed into wine or other liquids, they could become surprisingly potent. For someone facing severe pain, that could seem like a miracle. But every miracle had a price. Too much could suppress the body dangerously. And without precise dosing, the difference between relief and poisoning could be painfully small. Poppy preparations were among the most powerful medicines available to medieval healers. The plant was known for its ability to reduce pain and encourage sleep. Extracts could be prepared in different ways and sometimes mixed with wine or other liquids. For someone suffering from a serious injury, such medicine could feel almost miraculous. But the danger was obvious. Too much could cause extreme drowsiness, confusion, and potentially fatal breathing problems. Medieval healers did not understand these effects in modern chemical terms, but they knew that powerful medicines required caution. This was true of almost every intoxicating substance. The same plant could heal or harm. The difference might depend on the dose, the preparation, or simply the person receiving it. That uncertainty made herbal medicine both fascinating and frightening. Still, not everyone used these substances for physical pain. Some saw dreams, some wanted visions. Others believed altered states could help them communicate with the spiritual world. And then there were ordinary people who simply wanted a few peaceful hours away from the hardships of medieval life. A farmer exhausted after working from sunrise to sunset, a mother recovering from childbirth, a wounded soldier unable to sleep, a traveler suffering from pain. For them, intoxication was not necessarily about pleasure. Sometimes it was about escape. The medieval world offered very few reliable ways to escape discomfort. There were prayers, there were songs, there was alcohol, there were herbs, and there was sleep. But there was another group whose relationship with these substances was especially complicated. They were the healers who lived outside the formal medical system. Midwives, herbalists, wise women, traveling practitioners, people who knew the plants growing just beyond the village. And sometimes they knew far more than the educated physicians who looked down on them. In many medieval communities, healing did not always begin with a university-trained physician. Sometimes it began at home. A mother knew which herb might calm a child's stomach. A midwife knew how to assist during childbirth. An herbalist knew which roots could be dried and stored through winter. Much of this knowledge was passed from one generation to the next. These practitioners worked with what was available around them: leaves, flowers, roots, seeds, honey, wine, oil, and sometimes substances powerful enough to change consciousness. Their knowledge could be extremely valuable, but it was not always understood by authorities. Women who practiced healing could become particularly vulnerable to suspicion. A successful remedy might earn gratitude. A failed remedy might bring blame. And if a patient experienced strange visions after taking an herbal preparation, people could quickly begin asking uncomfortable questions. Was it medicine? Was it an accident? Or was something darker involved? The distinction between healing and magic was often blurry. A healer might recite a prayer while preparing an herbal remedy. To modern eyes, those actions seem separate. To medieval people, they could belong together. The natural world and the spiritual world were not necessarily viewed as opposites. Plants had properties. God had created those plants, and therefore, using them could be understood as part of the natural order. But some substances remained especially controversial. Anything that produced powerful hallucinations or uncontrollable behavior could attract suspicion. The church generally accepted legitimate medicine, but practices associated with divination, sorcery, or demonic activity were treated very differently. This created a strange situation. A monk preparing a sedative might be praised for his knowledge. A village woman preparing a similar substance might be viewed with suspicion. The substance could be identical. The social position of the person using it could change the entire interpretation. And that is one of the most important things to remember about medieval intoxication. It was never simply about chemistry. it was also about culture, religion, class, gender, and reputation. A strange experience could be called a miracle when it happened to a saint. The same experience could be called witchcraft when it happened to someone else. And as our journey continues, we begin to see that the medieval world had no single opinion about intoxication. Some people feared it, some respected it, some used it as medicine, and others simply wanted to know what would happen. So, how did medieval people actually feel about getting intoxicated? There was no single answer. For healers, a substance that reduced pain could be valuable medicine. For religious people, a strange vision might be interpreted as a spiritual experience. For ordinary villagers, alcohol might simply be part of dinner. But uncontrolled intoxication was another matter. Losing control of the body could be frightening. Someone who suddenly shouted at invisible figures or wandered into the night might be considered ill, cursed, or possessed. Intent mattered. A person taking medicine was not necessarily viewed as someone seeking pleasure. A person deliberately searching for supernatural visions could attract suspicion. And someone believed to be using magic might face far more serious consequences. This created a strange gray area. The medieval world did not clearly separate medicine, religion, folklore, and superstition. A single herb could belong to all four. The same plant could be recorded in a physician's book, grown in a monastery garden, used by a midwife, and mentioned in a story about witches. That ambiguity continued for centuries. But Europe was not the only place where people experimented with substances that changed perception. Far to the east and south, other civilizations had their own traditions. Some used fermented drinks. Others used plants. Some focused on medicine. Others connected altered states with spirituality. And while Europe had its mandrakes and henbane, the wider medieval world contained substances that were equally fascinating. One of them came from a plant that would eventually become famous across continents. Cannabis. Its history was much older than the Middle Ages. People had cultivated and used cannabis for fiber, medicine, and other purposes for thousands of years. But certain preparations could also produce intoxication. In parts of the medieval Islamic world, hashish became known and debated. And just like alcohol and herbal medicines, its story was filled with disagreement. Some people defended it, others condemned it, and authorities repeatedly struggled to control it. The history of intoxication, it seems, was already teaching the same lesson it would teach centuries later. People are remarkably difficult to stop from seeking altered states of mind. Cannabis did not suddenly appear in the medieval world. Its story was already ancient when medieval writers began describing it. Across parts of Asia and the Middle East, cannabis had been cultivated for practical purposes such as making rope, cloth, and other useful materials. But some preparations were also used for their effects on the mind. By the medieval period, hashish had become known in parts of the Islamic world. People did not all agree about it. Some scholars and physicians discussed its effects with curiosity. Others considered intoxication harmful and morally wrong, and authorities sometimes attempted to restrict its use. Yet laws and warnings did not always succeed. People continued to experiment. Hashish could be prepared in different ways, and its effects varied depending on the preparation and the person using it. For some, it was associated with relaxation. For others, it could produce confusion, drowsiness, or unusual perceptions. This made it difficult to place neatly into one category. Was it medicine? A recreational substance? A dangerous intoxicant? Or simply another plant with useful properties? Medieval societies had no modern laboratory system capable of giving a simple answer. Instead, people relied on observation, tradition, religious teachings, and personal experience. And that meant the debate could continue for generations. The more people tried to control intoxication, the more complicated the story became. Modern science does. There were no modern toxicology laboratories, no precise measurements, no chemical labels explaining exactly what was entering the bloodstream. Instead, knowledge was passed from person to person. A grandmother might know which plant helped with a particular problem. A monk might copy an old medical recipe into a manuscript. A physician might describe what happened after a patient consumed a certain preparation. Some of these observations were surprisingly practical. Others were mixed with superstition. This was especially dangerous when people misunderstood the difference between a useful dose and a harmful one. Too much of a powerful plant could cause severe confusion, unconsciousness, or even death. Yet the mysterious nature of these substances also gave them a strange reputation. If someone experienced visions after taking an unknown preparation, people might search for supernatural explanations. Perhaps the person had been bewitched. Perhaps a spirit had appeared. Perhaps the herb itself possessed mysterious powers. There was rarely a simple answer. And so, in medieval Europe and beyond, the boundary between medicine and magic remained remarkably thin. The same bottle of herbs could sit on a healer's shelf during the day and become the subject of frightening stories after sunset. For people living in that world, the mind itself could seem like an unexplored kingdom, and sometimes a single plant was enough to open its door. The medieval fascination with altered states did not belong only to scholars or healers. Ordinary people also had their own experiences. A cup of strong ale could make someone cheerful. Too much could make them loud, confused, or unable to walk properly. Wine could be used during meals, celebrations, religious ceremonies, and important gatherings. Because alcohol was so familiar, people often treated it differently from strange herbs. Yet the results could be just as dramatic. A person who drank too much might become reckless. They might argue with neighbors, damage property, or wake the entire household during the night. Medieval laws sometimes punished drunken behavior, especially when it disturbed the community. But drinking itself was not automatically considered sinful or unusual. The important question was often whether someone had lost control. That idea appeared repeatedly in medieval thinking. Enjoyment was one thing, excess was another. This distinction also appeared in religious teachings. Many religious authorities did not necessarily demand complete avoidance of every intoxicating substance. Instead, they often warned against allowing pleasure to control the individual. For ordinary people, however, life was already difficult. Work was exhausting. Food was uncertain. Winter was dangerous. Disease was common. So a warm drink shared with friends could provide a rare moment of comfort. Inside a crowded tavern, people could laugh, tell stories, sing songs, and forget their trouble for a little while. Outside, the medieval world remained cold and unforgiving. But inside, for a few hours, people could simply enjoy being alive. And perhaps that is one reason intoxicating drinks survived every warning ever made against them. Taverns became important places in many medieval communities. They were not simply places to drink. They could also function as meeting places, resting places, and centers of local gossip. Travelers might enter after spending hours on muddy roads. Merchants could discuss business. Farmers could exchange news. Strangers could hear stories about distant towns they might never visit. The drink itself was only part of the experience. Inside, the air might be warm and smoky. Wooden tables stood beneath dark beams, while candles or small lamps provided weak light. Conversation filled the room. Someone might be telling a story in one corner while another group argued over a game. For a traveler, a tavern could feel almost like a temporary home. But taverns also had a darker side. Arguments could become violent. Drunken customers could become unpredictable. Money could disappear quickly, and people who stayed too long might wake the next morning with little memory of what had happened. Authorities understood these problems. Some towns attempted to regulate taverns, controlling opening hours, prices, or behavior. Yet taverns remained popular. The reason was simple. People needed somewhere to meet. In a world without modern entertainment, restaurants, cafes, or online communication, a tavern could provide something extremely valuable: human company. After a long day of work, people wanted to talk. They wanted to laugh. They wanted to hear news. And sometimes, they simply wanted to forget their worries. The drink helped, but the real attraction was often the people sitting around it. And as night deepened outside. The tavern remained bright with voices and laughter. Beyond the tavern, another world of intoxication existed in quieter places. Monasteries contained gardens filled with medicinal plants. Monks carefully cultivated herbs that could be used to treat wounds, stomach problems, fevers, and pain. Some plants were harmless. Others were powerful enough to become dangerous. Knowledge about them was often copied from older medical texts and passed from one generation to another. A monk might spend hours grinding leaves, roots, or seeds into a powder. Another might prepare them in wine or water. The instructions could be surprisingly precise. But medieval medicine had one major problem. The people preparing these remedies did not understand chemistry. They knew what sometimes worked. They did not always know why. That difference mattered. A remedy that helped one person could make another seriously ill. And when something went wrong, people might blame the person's illness, bad luck, or even supernatural forces. Still, medieval healers were not simply wandering around randomly choosing plants. Many observed their patients carefully. They watched symptoms. They recorded treatments. They compared results. Their understanding was incomplete, but it was often based on generations of practical experience. The monastery garden, therefore, became a strange meeting point between knowledge and mystery. Rows of ordinary plants could hide substances capable of changing pain, sleep, mood, or perception. To a modern observer, some of these plants might look completely harmless. To a medieval healer, they could be powerful tools. And to someone who did not understand them, they could appear almost magical. Among the plants known to medieval healers, some had reputations far more frightening than others. Belladonna was one of them. Its dark berries looked almost inviting, but the plant contained powerful compounds that could affect the nervous system. Medieval people did not know about these chemicals. They only knew what happened when someone consumed too much. The person might become confused. Their behavior could change. Their vision might become strange. In severe cases, the consequences could be deadly. Other plants carried similar dangers. Henbane was another unusual herb. It had been known since ancient times and was sometimes associated with medicine, pain relief, and sleep. But it could also produce delirium. A person might speak strangely, become disoriented, or appear to see things that were not really there. Imagine witnessing that without knowing anything about toxicology. A perfectly normal person suddenly begins acting as though another world has opened around them. To medieval observers, supernatural explanations could seem reasonable. Perhaps a spirit was involved. Perhaps the person had been cursed. Perhaps they had encountered something beyond ordinary human understanding. This is where the history of intoxicants becomes especially fascinating. The substance itself was physical. The interpretation was cultural. The same strange experience could be described as poisoning by one person, magic by another, and divine revelation by someone else. And without modern science to settle the argument, all three explanations could survive. For centuries, plants remained mysterious because people understood their effects long before they understood their chemistry. Among the strangest substances known to medieval people were those connected with sleep. Sleep itself was mysterious. People knew that certain herbs could make someone drowsy, but they did not understand how the brain created dreams. So when a person fell into an unusually deep sleep after taking a plant preparation, the experience could seem almost supernatural. One of the best-known examples was the poppy. Its sap could produce powerful effects, and preparations made from it had been used since ancient times. Medieval healers inherited some of this knowledge. They knew that certain preparations could reduce pain and encourage sleep. But they also knew that too much could be extremely dangerous. The difference between medicine and poison could sometimes be surprisingly small. A healer, therefore, had to rely on experience and careful judgment. There were no modern measuring devices, no standardized tablets, no printed instructions explaining an exact dosage. Instead, remedies were often prepared by hand. The strength could vary from one preparation to another. This made powerful medicines particularly risky. Still, People continued using them because pain was a constant part of medieval life. Broken bones, infected wounds, childbirth, and serious illnesses could cause suffering that modern medicine can often control. A substance that brought even temporary relief could therefore seem incredibly valuable. And so medieval medicine continued walking a narrow path. On one side was healing, on the other was danger. Between them stood the healer, trying to decide how much was enough. For centuries, that uncertain balance shaped humanity's relationship with intoxicating plants. Not every altered state came from a plant. Medieval people could experience strange sensations through exhaustion, hunger, illness, fever, and lack of sleep. This was especially important because people often searched for explanations when their bodies behaved strangely. A person suffering from a high fever might see figures that were not really there. Someone who had gone without food for a long time could become weak, confused, or dizzy. A traveler lost in the wilderness might hear sounds and imagine movement in the darkness. To modern eyes, these experiences can have ordinary explanations. But to medieval people, the world was filled with possibilities beyond the visible. Spirits, demons, saints, curses, and supernatural forces were part of the stories and beliefs surrounding everyday life. So an unusual experience could quickly become something much larger. This did not mean medieval people were foolish. They were trying to understand a world without modern medical knowledge. When a person suddenly behaved strangely, the community needed an explanation. Sometimes the answer was illness. Sometimes it was believed to be possession. Sometimes it was simply blamed on something the person had eaten or drunk. And occasionally, nobody knew. That uncertainty created a fascinating relationship between the human mind and medieval culture. Dreams could carry messages. Visions could be interpreted as signs. Nightmares could become warnings. And intoxication could blur the boundary between ordinary experience and the supernatural. The mind remained one of the greatest mysteries of the medieval world. People could see the stars above them and wonder about heaven. They could enter a dream and wonder whether they had visited somewhere beyond it. And sometimes, a strange herb could make those questions even harder to answer. Dreams held a special place in the medieval imagination. When a person fell asleep, the body remained in bed, but the mind seemed to travel somewhere else. A dream could contain familiar faces, strange landscapes, animals, battles, or conversations with people who had already died. For medieval people, these experiences were not always dismissed as meaningless. Some believed dreams could contain warnings or messages. Religious traditions also gave dreams an important place in stories about prophets, saints, and visions. But dreams could also be frightening. A nightmare might leave someone awake in darkness, convinced that something terrible had happened. This was especially powerful in a world where darkness itself was difficult to escape. There were no electric lights. Once the candle went out, a room could become almost completely black. Outside, forests and roads were equally dark. Every strange sound seemed louder. A branch moving in the wind could sound like footsteps. An animal calling in the distance could become something mysterious. And after waking from a nightmare, the boundary between dream and reality could feel very thin. Some people searched for explanations in religion. Others turned to traditional remedies. Certain herbs were believed to encourage sleep or protect against bad dreams. Whether they actually worked was another question. Still, the belief itself mattered. A person who believed a particular herb would bring peaceful sleep might feel safer after taking it. And sometimes, that feeling of safety was enough to change the experience. The medieval night was therefore more than darkness. It was a time when dreams, fears, beliefs, and imagination could all become mixed together. And somewhere between sleep and waking, people sometimes experienced things they could not easily explain. As knowledge traveled between cultures, ideas about plants and intoxication traveled with it. Merchants crossed deserts. Travelers moved along ancient roads. Scholars translated books from one language into another. With them came information about medicines, spices, poisons, and plants that could affect the mind. The medieval world was more connected than it might first appear. A plant growing in one region could eventually become known thousands of miles away. Medical knowledge moved especially well. A physician might read a description written by someone who had lived centuries earlier and try to apply the same treatment to a patient. Sometimes the information was useful. Sometimes it was misunderstood. Sometimes the original writer had included observations that were based more on tradition than fact. Still, the knowledge continued to spread. The Islamic world played an important role in preserving and developing earlier medical traditions. Scholars studied Greek, Persian, Indian, and other sources, comparing different ideas about the human body and disease. They also recorded their own observations. This created a large body of medical knowledge that would later influence European medicine. Among those traditions were descriptions of substances that affected sleep, pain, mood, and perception. Not every substance was used for intoxication. Many had practical purposes. But once people discovered that a plant could change how the body felt, curiosity naturally followed. What happened if the amount was increased? What happened if it was mixed with another substance? Could it reduce pain? Could it create sleep? Could it produce unusual visions? Questions like these continued to appear across different societies. And slowly, the history of intoxication became part of the much larger history of medicine itself. By the later Middle Ages, Europe had become a place where old knowledge and new ideas constantly crossed paths. Universities were growing. Physicians were studying older medical texts. Apothecaries were preparing medicines from herbs, spices, roots, and other substances. For the first time, medical knowledge was becoming more organized. But this did not mean mystery had disappeared. Far from it. A physician might understand that a certain herb could cause sleep without understanding exactly why. An apothecary might know that a particular preparation could reduce pain while still being unable to explain its effects on the brain. And ordinary people continued to rely on traditional knowledge passed down through families. This created several different worlds of medicine at once. There was learned medicine, there was folk medicine, there was religious healing, and there were practices that authorities considered suspicious or dangerous. Sometimes these worlds overlapped. A woman preparing herbs in her kitchen might be following knowledge that had been passed down for generations. Her neighbors might consider her a skilled healer, but if something went wrong, the same knowledge could suddenly appear frightening. This was especially true when accusations of magic entered the story. A mysterious illness needed an explanation. A strange behavior needed a cause. And sometimes, suspicion fell upon the person who knew the most about plants. This did not mean every herbalist was accused of witchcraft. Most were not. But the connection between herbs, healing, and supernatural beliefs could create fear. As medieval society changed, that fear would become increasingly important. The same plants that had once been viewed simply as medicines could become symbols of something much darker. Stories about witches began appearing more frequently in European folklore. These stories often included mysterious herbs, strange potions, nighttime gatherings, and supernatural powers. But the reality was usually far less dramatic. Most people who worked with plants were simply trying to heal the sick. Still, folklore had a powerful influence. A person who lived alone, understood unusual remedies, or behaved differently from the rest of the village could attract suspicion. Rumors were especially dangerous in small communities. One strange event could become a story. The story could become a rumor, and the rumor could eventually become an accusation. If a neighbor became sick after an argument, someone might wonder whether the illness had been caused deliberately. If a person suddenly became confused after eating something, people might suspect a curse. There was often no reliable way to prove what had actually happened. Fear filled the gaps in knowledge. Yet the idea of the witch was not simply about intoxicating plants. It was connected to deeper fears about illness, death, religion, sexuality, poverty, and social conflict. Plants were only one piece of the puzzle. Still, Certain herbs became associated with magical practices because they could produce visible changes in the body. A person might become sleepy. Their pupils might change. They might become confused or delirious. To someone watching without medical knowledge, such effects could look supernatural. And so the boundary between chemistry and magic became increasingly blurred. The plant itself had no intention. It was simply a plant, but the people who used it could give it an entirely different meaning. That meaning would eventually shape some of the darkest stories in European history. As stories about magic spread, fears sometimes became stronger than knowledge. A person who understood unusual herbs could become both respected and feared. If the remedies worked, neighbors might call that person wise. If something went wrong, they might suddenly become suspicious. This was especially dangerous for people who lived on the edges of their communities. A widow, an elderly woman, or a person known for strange habits could easily become the subject of gossip. But the reality behind medieval healing was usually much simpler. People were sick, people were in pain, people needed help, and plants were among the few resources available to them. A healer might collect leaves from a forest, dry them beside a fire, and store them through the winter. Another might prepare roots in wine or water. The instructions could come from family tradition or an old manuscript. Some treatments probably helped, others did nothing, and some were genuinely dangerous. The problem was that medieval people had no modern system for testing medicine safely. There were no clinical trials, no standardized doses, no detailed understanding of side effects. Experience was the main teacher, and experience could be unforgiving. Still, people continued experimenting because the alternative was often worse. A person suffering from severe pain could not simply wait for modern medicine to arrive. They had to use what was available. Sometimes that meant a harmless herb. Sometimes it meant a powerful substance. And sometimes the difference between relief and danger was only a small change in quantity. That uncertainty would remain a central part of medicine for centuries. The search for relief was not limited to Europe. Across Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa, people developed their own traditions of medicine and intoxication. Different cultures used different plants, drinks, and preparations. Some were intended to treat illness. Others were used during celebrations or religious ceremonies. And some were simply used because people enjoyed their effects. The details varied, but the basic human desire was remarkably similar. People wanted to feel better. They wanted to reduce pain. They wanted to sleep. They wanted to celebrate. Sometimes, they simply wanted to escape their worries for a few hours. This last reason is important. Life in the medieval world could be physically exhausting and emotionally difficult. Disease was common. War could destroy communities. Harvests could fail. Families could lose loved ones suddenly. There were few reliable ways to escape stress. A drink, a gathering, a story, or a traditional remedy could provide temporary comfort. That does not mean medieval people were constantly intoxicated. Most were not. For most ordinary workers, daily life required clear minds and steady hands. Farmers had fields to manage. Craftsmen had work to complete. Parents had children to care for. Too much intoxication could make ordinary responsibilities impossible. So most societies developed their own rules about when drinking or using certain substances was acceptable. Celebrations were different from ordinary days. Medicine was different from recreation, and religious practices were different from both. The boundaries were not always clear, but people understood one basic truth. Anything powerful enough to change the mind could also change behavior, and that made intoxication both attractive and dangerous. As medieval centuries passed, people became increasingly interested in understanding the natural world. Physicians observed symptoms. Apothecaries collected recipes. Scholars compared older texts. And travelers brought unfamiliar plants from distant lands. Slowly, knowledge began to accumulate. But the old beliefs did not disappear overnight. A physician could believe in careful observation while also accepting ideas that seem strange today. This was normal for the period. Science and tradition were not separate worlds yet. They existed together. The same medical book might contain a useful description of a plant alongside an explanation based on astrology or supernatural theory. To modern readers, this mixture can seem confusing, but for medieval scholars, it made sense. The natural world was believed to have hidden connections. The stars, the seasons, plants, animals, and human bodies were all part of a larger order. If a particular herb seemed to work at a certain time or under certain conditions, people wanted to understand why. Sometimes they found a practical answer. Sometimes they found an explanation that belonged more to belief than evidence. Either way, the information was preserved, and this preservation mattered. Centuries later, European physicians would inherit many of these texts and begin questioning them. They would test old claims. Some would survive, others would disappear. The story of intoxicating substances followed the same path. Ancient knowledge was copied, medieval knowledge expanded it, and eventually, early modern science will begin separating observation from superstition. But that transformation was still far away. For now, people were standing between two worlds. One was built on tradition. The other was slowly beginning to ask a new question. What if nature could be understood without magic? That question would eventually change the history of medicine. But during the medieval period, progress was slow. Knowledge moved at the speed of horses, ships, and handwritten books. A medical idea could take years to travel from one city to another. A manuscript had to be copied by hand. A mistake in one copy could become part of the next. Still, knowledge continued moving. Monasteries preserved books. Physicians taught students. Merchants carried plants across long distances, and travelers described unfamiliar customs. Every generation added something to what had come before. Some discoveries were accidental. A healer might notice that a certain preparation made pain easier to tolerate. Another might observe that a different plant caused sleep. Someone else might discover that too much of the same substance produced frightening effects. These observations became practical knowledge. They were not modern experiments, but they were still observations. And over time, patterns became visible. People learned which plants were useful. They learned which preparations were dangerous. They learned that the same substance could help in one situation and harm in another. This was one of the most important lessons in the entire history of medicine. The difference between medicine and poison was often not the substance itself. It was the amount, the preparation, and the person receiving it. Medieval healers could not explain this through modern chemistry. But through experience, many began to understand the principle. And that knowledge would survive long after the medieval world itself disappeared. The mysterious herbs of the past were slowly becoming subjects of serious study. The age of superstition was not ending yet, but another age was quietly approaching. By the end of the medieval period, the world of intoxicants was becoming increasingly complicated. Old traditions were still alive. People continued drinking wine and ale. Healers continued using herbs. Apothecaries continued preparing mixtures from plants, roots, seeds, and spices. But new ideas were beginning to challenge old explanations. European cities were growing. Trade routes were expanding. More books were being produced, and knowledge could travel farther than before. People encountered substances that had once been completely unfamiliar to them. Some were valuable medicines. Others were dangerous. Some became popular simply because they produced unusual effects. Yet society continued asking the same old questions. Was intoxication sinful? Was it medicinal? Was it harmless entertainment? Or could it become dangerous enough to threaten the community? There was rarely one universal answer. A substance could be accepted in one place and condemned in another. A physician might recommend something that a religious authority disliked. A family might use a traditional remedy that an educated doctor considered foolish. Different forms of knowledge competed with one another. But beneath all these arguments was a simple human reality. People wanted to change how they felt. They wanted to escape pain. They wanted to sleep. They wanted to celebrate. They wanted to forget fear. And sometimes they simply wanted to experience something unusual. That desire did not begin in medieval Europe. It had existed for thousands of years. And it would continue long after castles, monasteries, and medieval villages had disappeared. The story was moving toward a new age. An age when exploration, trade, science, and empire would bring an extraordinary number of new substances into the world. The arrival of new trade routes changed everything. European merchants began encountering goods from distant parts of the world. Spices, medicines, dyes, and unfamiliar plants traveled across oceans and deserts. Some were expensive curiosities. Others quickly became valuable commodities. People had always exchanged useful plants, but expanding trade made that exchange faster and wider. A substance that had been known in one region for centuries could suddenly become an object of fascination somewhere else. At the same time, European scholars were becoming more interested in observing nature directly. Old books were still respected, but some thinkers began asking whether every ancient claim was actually true. They wanted evidence. They wanted to compare observations. They wanted to understand how the natural world really worked. This change did not happen overnight. For generations, traditional beliefs and new methods existed side by side. But eventually, the difference became impossible to ignore. A strange vision was no longer automatically treated as a supernatural event. A powerful herb could be examined as a physical substance. A person's behavior could be studied as a result of what entered the body. These ideas helped create the foundations of modern pharmacology. Yet the old fascination with intoxication remained. People still saw drinks that changed mood. They still experimented with plants. They still searched for remedies that could ease pain or create sleep. Human curiosity had not disappeared. Science simply gave that curiosity new tools. The medieval world had spent centuries asking what mysterious substances could do. The coming centuries would begin asking a different question. Why do they do it? And that question would lead humanity into a completely new chapter. As the medieval world slowly gave way to the early modern age, the meaning of intoxication began to change. People still drank wine and ale. They still used traditional herbs. But exploration brought unfamiliar substances into European markets, and curiosity grew around them. Merchants carried goods from distant regions. Physicians examined foreign plants. Apothecaries experimented with new ingredients. Some substances were praised as medicines. Others were treated with suspicion. And some became fashionable among wealthy people who enjoyed collecting rare objects from distant lands. The great difference was that information was now spreading faster. Books could be reproduced more widely. Medical knowledge could reach more readers. Descriptions of plants and their effects could be compared across different sources. Mistakes still happened, but knowledge no longer had to remain inside a single village or monastery. At the same time, people were beginning to understand that intoxication was not simply a question of morality. It could affect the body. It could affect behavior. It could affect memory and perception. These observations encouraged physicians to look more closely at what substances actually did. The old question of whether something was good or bad slowly became more complicated. A substance could be useful in one situation and harmful in another. A medicine could become dangerous if misused. A common drink could become harmful through excess. And a plant that looked harmless could contain powerful compounds. The medieval world had discovered these truths through experience. The early modern world was beginning to investigate them systematically. The mystery was slowly becoming science. But humanity's fascination with altered states was nowhere near finished. Cannabis was not simply a strange substance from distant lands. It was also a useful plant. Its strong fibers could be turned into rope, cloth, fishing nets, and other practical materials. For many people, this was the ordinary side of cannabis. The intoxicating side was more complicated. In some parts of the medieval Islamic world, people knew that preparations made from cannabis could produce unusual sensations. Some described feelings of relaxation. Others reported laughter, changes in perception, or a dreamlike state. But scholars and religious authorities did not always agree about what this meant. The question was not only whether cannabis could intoxicate, it was whether intoxication itself was forbidden. Alcohol already provided a difficult example. Islamic teachings strongly condemned wine and drunkenness, yet cannabis did not always fit neatly into the same legal discussions. Different scholars reached different conclusions. Some argued that anything capable of causing intoxication should be treated with suspicion. Others distinguished between substances according to their effects, purpose, and amount. This created debates that could become surprisingly detailed. How much was consumed? Why was it consumed? Did it cause a person to lose control? Was it being used as medicine? And was the person seeking pleasure or attempting to escape reality? These questions sound remarkably modern, but medieval societies were already asking them. Meanwhile, cannabis continued to travel. Merchants, travelers, scholars, and armies carried plants and knowledge across enormous distances. The medieval world was connected by trade routes stretching from North Africa to Central Asia and beyond. Ideas traveled along those same roads. So did medicines. So did recipes. And inevitably, so did intoxicants. A substance discovered in one region could eventually appear hundreds or thousands of miles away. The world was becoming a network of shared habits. And wherever people gathered, they experimented. Some sought relief from pain. Some wanted sleep. Some wanted religious visions. Some simply wanted to feel different for a few hours. The reasons changed. The desire remained. As cannabis traveled through the medieval world, another question became impossible to ignore. What exactly happened when a person used it? Medieval observers did not have modern neuroscience. They could not explain receptors, brain chemistry, or neurotransmitters. Instead, they described what they could see. A person might become unusually quiet. Another might laugh without an obvious reason. Someone might become deeply absorbed in conversation, music, food, or their own thoughts. To an outside observer, intoxication could look almost mysterious. And mystery often creates stories. Stories, in turn, can become legends. This was especially true when unusual experiences were connected to religious beliefs or secretive groups. Rumors could transform ordinary practices into something far more dramatic. A small amount of historical evidence might eventually become an enormous tale. This happened repeatedly with intoxicating substances. People imagined secret societies, mysterious gardens, hidden ceremonies, and men who were supposedly willing to die because they had been promised visions of paradise. Some of these stories were based on real people. Others were exaggerated by travelers who had never witnessed the events themselves. And once a dramatic story entered European literature, it could become almost impossible to separate fact from imagination. The medieval world loved stories of hidden knowledge. A mysterious herb fit perfectly into that imagination. But ordinary people rarely experienced history in such dramatic ways. For most villagers, merchants, farmers, and craftsmen, intoxicants were much more practical. A drink after a day's work, a herbal remedy for pain, a plant used for sleep, a strong substance taken during illness. Life was difficult enough without turning every unusual experience into a supernatural mystery. Still, the line between ordinary medicine and magical belief remained thin. A healer might prepare a mixture using several plants. The patient might feel better. The healer might believe the plants had natural properties. A neighbor might believe something supernatural had happened. All three people could look at the same event and understand it completely differently. And that difference in interpretation shaped the history of intoxication. By the later Middle Ages, European society had developed a complicated relationship with intoxication. Alcohol was everywhere. Wine appeared on noble tables and in humble households. Ale was common among ordinary people, especially where clean drinking water was difficult to obtain. Drinking was not automatically considered sinful. The problem was excess. A person who became dangerously drunk could be criticized, punished, or simply remembered as a fool. But alcohol had one advantage over many mysterious herbs. Everyone understood it. Its effects were familiar. People knew what happened after too much wine. They knew the stumbling walk, the loud voice, the sudden confidence, the argument that seemed very important at midnight and very embarrassing the next morning. Herbal intoxicants were different. Their effects could vary greatly depending on the plant, preparation, and amount. That uncertainty made them more frightening. A person might expect relaxation and instead experience confusion. Another might expect medicine and discover an entirely different effect. Without modern measurement, there was no reliable way to know the strength of a preparation. A healer could carefully prepare a mixture, but another person might use the same plant incorrectly, and that could be dangerous. This uncertainty explains why knowledge about herbs was usually passed through experienced people. Physicians learned from books and teachers. Monks cultivated medicinal gardens. Midwives passed knowledge from one generation to another. Village healers developed reputations based on years of experience. Their knowledge was not always scientifically correct, but much of it came from observation. People noticed which plants helped wounds, which eased pain, which caused sleep, and which should never be touched. The medieval herbal tradition was therefore a mixture of useful knowledge, misunderstanding, tradition, and superstition. It could save a life. It could also cause harm. And somewhere between those two possibilities lived the fascinating history of intoxication. People were searching for relief. They were searching for pleasure. Sometimes they were searching for something they could not even explain. A different state of mind. A moment when the ordinary world seemed to disappear. And that desire would continue long after the medieval world itself had vanished. As the Middle Ages slowly gave way to the early modern world, attitudes toward intoxicating substances began to change. Trade expanded. Ships crossed oceans. Merchants carried spices, medicines, tobacco, and unfamiliar plants between continents. Europe was entering a period of enormous exchange. And with every new discovery came new opportunities for pleasure, medicine, and experimentation. Tobacco was one of the most important examples. When Europeans encountered tobacco in the Americas, they were fascinated by the way indigenous peoples used it. The plant was not simply treated as a recreational substance. In many communities, tobacco had medicinal, ceremonial, and social roles. European visitors carried it back across the Atlantic. Soon, tobacco had become a subject of curiosity among physicians and wealthy Europeans. Some believed it could treat illnesses. Others warned that it was dangerous. Governments eventually discovered something else. Tobacco could be taxed. And once governments realized that an intoxicating substance could produce enormous revenue, controlling it became more complicated. The story repeated itself. A substance could be praised as medicine, condemned as immoral, enjoyed as pleasure, and taxed as business. The same plant could move through all four categories. Meanwhile, older European substances remained. Alcohol continued to dominate everyday life. Opium appeared in medical traditions. Cannabis remained known in parts of Europe and the wider Islamic world. Herbal preparations continued to be used by healers. The difference was that the world was becoming increasingly connected. Knowledge no longer traveled only through neighboring villages or regional trade routes. It could cross oceans. A plant from one continent could become familiar on another within a surprisingly short time. Human curiosity had created a global marketplace of substances. And this created a new problem. Authorities could no longer control only what grew locally. They had to regulate things arriving from thousands of miles away. The history of intoxication was becoming international. What had once been a collection of local traditions was slowly becoming a global story. And beneath all the laws, warnings, medicines, and moral arguments, one simple human desire remained. People wanted to change how they felt, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for a night, and sometimes simply long enough to forget the difficult world around them. But the desire to escape reality was never limited to plants or drinks. People also discovered that the mind could be changed through exhaustion, fasting, darkness, music, and intense religious practice. In medieval Europe, some monks deliberately reduced their food and sleep. They spent long hours praying in silence. Some lived in dark cells. Others isolated themselves from ordinary society. The purpose was not entertainment. It was spiritual discipline. Yet the human brain does not always distinguish neatly between physical and spiritual experiences. Extreme exhaustion can produce vivid dreams. Long periods of fasting can change how a person feels. Isolation can make ordinary sounds seem strangely powerful. An intense prayer can create experiences that feel completely real. To medieval people, such experiences might be interpreted through religion. A vision could be understood as a message from God. A frightening apparition might be seen as a demon. A powerful sensation might be considered a spiritual revelation. Today, we might describe some of these experiences differently. But the important point is that people were experimenting with consciousness long before modern laboratories existed. They were simply using different methods. The search for altered states was not always about intoxication. Sometimes it was about finding God. Sometimes it was about escaping suffering. Sometimes it was about understanding the unknown. And sometimes, quite simply, people wanted to feel something beyond ordinary life. This helps explain why intoxicating substances appeared in so many cultures. The human brain naturally creates dreams, visions, emotions, and unusual sensations. People noticed that certain substances could influence those experiences. Then they began sharing that knowledge. A healer taught an apprentice. A traveler described a foreign plant. A merchant carried a new substance across a trade route. A monk recorded an herb in a manuscript. Slowly, knowledge accumulated. Some of it was accurate. Some of it was completely wrong. And some of it remained impossible to verify. But the tradition continued. Generation after generation, people kept searching for ways to sleep deeper, hurt less, dream more vividly, celebrate harder, pray more intensely, or simply forget their troubles. The substances changed. The cultures changed. The centuries changed. But the human curiosity remained almost exactly the same. By now, the story of intoxication had become much larger than a collection of strange plants. It was a story about human behavior. Across medieval societies, people repeatedly discovered that ordinary consciousness could be changed. Sometimes through alcohol, sometimes through medicine, sometimes through plants, sometimes through fasting, prayer, music, or exhaustion. And each society created its own rules around those experiences. Some substances were accepted, some were restricted, some were praised as medicine, others were feared as magic. But almost nothing was completely simple. Even alcohol, the most familiar intoxicant of all, could be both ordinary and dangerous. A cup of wine might accompany dinner. Too much wine could destroy a person's judgment. The same substance could therefore be respectable in one situation and shameful in another. The medieval world understood this difference surprisingly well. What mattered was not always the substance itself. It was how, why, and how much it was used. This idea would survive for centuries. As European societies became more connected, new substances entered the picture. Tobacco crossed the Atlantic. Cannabis remained part of older medical and cultural traditions. Opium and other preparations continued to appear in healing practices. And countless herbs remained in the hands of physicians, monks, midwives, and ordinary households. Some of these substances genuinely helped people. Others were dangerous, and some probably did very little at all. Without modern testing, people often had to judge a remedy by personal experience. If someone recovered after taking an herb, the herb received credit. If someone became sick, there might be another explanation. This made medical knowledge difficult to separate from belief. Still, people kept experimenting. They observed, they recorded, they argued, they passed knowledge from one generation to the next. And slowly, humanity built a long history of discovering what different substances could do. The medieval period was only one chapter, but it was an important one. Because long before modern medicine, how much control are we willing to give up in exchange for feeling different? The answers to those questions became even more complicated as the medieval world disappeared. European societies entered the Renaissance and then the early modern period. Books became easier to reproduce. Travel increased. Medical knowledge expanded. And information about plants began moving more quickly between regions. Old herbal traditions were copied into new books. Some were tested more carefully. Others survived simply because generations of people trusted them. The mysterious plants of medieval folklore slowly became subjects of observation. Physicians began paying closer attention to preparation, dosage, and effects. This did not suddenly make medicine modern. Far from it. Many treatments were still ineffective or dangerous. But a gradual change was taking place. People were beginning to understand that the same substance could produce very different results depending on how much was used. A tiny amount might have little effect. A larger amount might cause sleep or confusion. Too much could become deadly. This basic idea seems obvious today, but understanding it was an important step in the history of medicine. It also changed how people thought about intoxication. Instead of seeing every unusual reaction as supernatural, some observers began searching for physical explanations. A strange vision might come from the brain. A deep sleep might come from a chemical effect. A sudden illness might be caused by an excessive dose. The supernatural did not disappear. People continued to believe in magic, spirits, and curses. But another way of understanding the world was becoming stronger. Observation, experiment, and eventually science. Yet the old human desire remained. People still wanted relief from pain. They still wanted better sleep. They still wanted pleasure. And sometimes they still wanted to escape ordinary consciousness. The substances might change. The explanations might change. But the motivation was remarkably familiar. Even centuries later, the human story had not really changed. We were still searching for ways to alter the experience of being alive. And that search was about to enter an entirely new age. The new age brought something the medieval world could never have imagined. A truly global exchange of substances. Ships crossed oceans regularly. European merchants reached Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Plants that had once belonged to distant cultures suddenly appeared in European ports. Tobacco became fashionable. Coffee spread through cities. Tea became increasingly important. Chocolate crossed the Atlantic. Each substance affected the mind in a different way, and people quickly became fascinated by those effects. Coffee, for example, did not intoxicate people in the same way as alcohol. Instead, it made many drinkers feel more awake. For scholars, merchants, and workers, that could be extremely useful. Coffee houses began appearing in different parts of the world. They became places for conversation, business, politics, literature, and argument. A drink had created a social environment. Tea played a similar role. Chocolate was enjoyed as both food and luxury. The world of intoxicants was becoming a world of stimulants, relaxants, medicines, and pleasures. People were learning that changing the mind did not always mean becoming drunk. Sometimes the goal was simply to become more alert, sometimes calmer, sometimes more energetic, sometimes more imaginative. This was an important shift. The human relationship with substances was becoming more sophisticated, but also created new opportunities for trade and profit. Governments discovered that popular substances could generate enormous taxes. Merchants discovered that people would travel great distances for them. And companies eventually discovered that entire industries could be built around them. The humble plant had become a global commodity. Yet behind the business was still the individual human being. A tired worker drinking coffee. A traveler smoking tobacco. A family sharing tea. A patient receiving a medicinal preparation. A person drinking wine after a difficult day. Different substances. Different cultures. Different purposes. But the same basic human desire remained. People wanted to change their physical or emotional state. Sometimes they wanted to feel less. Sometimes they wanted to feel more. And sometimes they simply wanted a few quiet hours away from the weight of everyday life. The long history that began with ancient herbs was becoming something much bigger. It was becoming a global history of the human mind. As these substances spread around the world, societies began creating stronger rules around them. Governments wanted to know what people were consuming. Religious authorities wanted to decide what was acceptable. Physicians wanted to determine what was useful. And merchants wanted to sell as much as possible. These interests did not always agree. A substance could be considered dangerous by a physician while remaining profitable for a merchant. A government might condemn public drunkenness while taxing alcohol. A religious leader might warn against excess while ordinary people continued drinking. The contradictions were everywhere, and they were not new. Medieval societies had faced many of the same problems. The difference was scale. Now substances could travel across oceans and reach millions of people. This created new fears. What if a substance became too popular? What if people became dependent on it? What if workers could not function without it? What if young people began using it? These questions slowly became part of public debate. At the same time, medical science was developing. Chemists began isolating individual compounds from plants. Instead of using an entire herb, researchers could eventually identify specific chemicals responsible for particular effects. This was a major turning point. The mysterious power of a plant could now be investigated at a much deeper level. But there was a price. Once powerful substances could be isolated and concentrated, their effects could become much stronger. A traditional remedy might contain a small amount of an active compound. A purified chemical could contain far more. Medicine gained enormous possibilities. So did danger. Humanity had moved from simply discovering intoxicating plants to understanding, extracting, and eventually manufacturing their active ingredients. The old herbal world was disappearing. The laboratory was taking its place. But the oldest question remained. What happens when a human being finds a substance capable of changing a mind? The answer was becoming increasingly important, because now humans were no longer limited to what nature happened to provide. They were beginning to create stronger versions themselves. The rise of modern chemistry changed the story forever. For thousands of years, people had relied on plants in their natural form. A leaf, a seed, a root, a flower. But scientists eventually learned that plants contain specific chemical substances responsible for many of their effects. This discovery opened an entirely new world. A plant could now be studied, measured, and processed. One of the most famous examples was opium. People had known about the poppy for thousands of years. Its latex could relieve pain and produce sleep. But in the 19th century, scientists isolated morphine from opium. Suddenly, medicine had access to a much more concentrated substance. It was powerful. It could reduce severe pain. It could also create dependence. This revealed an important truth. A substance could be both extremely useful and extremely dangerous. The same discovery happened with other plants. Chemists isolated active compounds from coca leaves, cannabis, and many medicinal herbs. The ancient knowledge of plants was being transformed into modern pharmacology. Doctors could now prescribe measured doses rather than relying entirely on traditional preparations. This was a remarkable improvement, but stronger substances created stronger problems. People could become dependent on medicines that had originally been intended to help them. Some substances that were once ordinary remedies began to acquire frightening reputations. Governments responded with new regulations. Pharmacies became more controlled. Certain drugs required prescriptions. Others were restricted or prohibited. The age of modern drug laws had begun. Yet these laws did not erase the ancient human desire to alter consciousness. They simply changed which substances were considered acceptable. Alcohol remained legal in many societies. Coffee and tea became everyday drinks. Tobacco became a massive global industry. Some medicines became tightly controlled. Others were freely available. The boundary between medicine, pleasure, and danger continued to move. And perhaps that is the most interesting lesson of the entire story. Human beings never stopped experimenting. We only became better at understanding what we were experimenting with. The medieval healer had herbs. The modern chemist had laboratories. But both were trying to answer the same basic question. How can a substance change the way a human being feels? By the 20th century, the story had entered a completely different stage. Scientists could now study the brain itself. They discovered that drugs did not simply create mysterious changes in the mind. They interacted with specific systems inside the body. Some increased activity, some slowed it down, some changed mood, others affected memory, pain, sleep, or perception. The ancient mystery of intoxication was slowly becoming a scientific subject. But scientific knowledge did not make the debate disappear. In some ways, it made the debate even larger. Governments began creating international agreements to control certain substances. Some drugs became illegal. Others remained legal because they were deeply connected to culture, medicine, or commerce. Alcohol was one of the clearest examples. It could cause enormous social harm, yet remained legal in much of the world. Tobacco created severe health risks, yet millions of people continued using it. Meanwhile, substances associated with illegal markets were often treated very differently. This showed that the history of drugs was never only about chemistry. It was also about culture, economics, religion, politics, and power. A substance did not become accepted or forbidden simply because of what it did to the brain. Society decided what meaning that substance carried. Wine could represent celebration. Coffee could represent work. Medicine could represent healing. Cannabis could represent either tradition or rebellion, depending on the society. The same chemical could therefore have completely different reputations in different places. And that was true long before modern governments existed. The medieval villager, the Islamic scholar, the monastery healer, and the modern scientist were all looking at altered consciousness through different cultural lenses. Yet underneath those differences was something remarkably constant. People experience pain. People experience fear. People become tired. People seek pleasure. People become curious. And sometimes, people simply want to step outside their ordinary state of mind. The methods have changed enormously. The desire has not. From ancient fermented drinks to medieval herbs, from cannabis and tobacco to modern pharmaceuticals, the history of intoxication is ultimately a history of human curiosity. And that story is still being written. By the modern era, people had learned an enormous amount about intoxicating substances. Scientists could identify active chemicals. Doctors could measure doses. Governments could create laws. And laboratories could produce substances that nature had never provided in such concentrated forms. Yet one problem remains surprisingly difficult: human behavior. Knowing that something is dangerous does not always stop people from using it. A person may understand the risks of alcohol and still drink. Someone may know that tobacco is harmful and still smoke. A patient may become dependent on a medicine that was originally prescribed to help them. Knowledge can explain danger. It cannot always overcome desire. This was something medieval societies had already discovered. Warnings existed. Religious teachings existed. Laws existed. But people continued seeking altered states. The modern world simply gave them more choices. Some people wanted stimulation. Others wanted relaxation. Some wanted pain relief. Others wanted pleasure. And some wanted to escape emotional suffering. This last reason became especially important as modern societies became more aware of mental health and addiction. Scientists began studying dependence as a medical and psychological problem rather than simply a moral failure. That was another major change. For centuries, intoxicated people had often been judged as weak, sinful, foolish, or dangerous. Modern research increasingly showed that repeated substance use could alter the brain and behavior. Addiction could become a powerful condition that was difficult to control. This did not remove personal responsibility, but it changed the way many societies understood the problem. Instead of asking only, why does this person keep doing it? People began asking, what is happening inside this person's brain and life? The question was more compassionate. It was also more scientific. And once again, history had come full circle. Ancient healers had tried to understand mysterious plants. Medieval physicians had recorded their effects. Early modern chemists had isolated their compounds. Modern scientists were now studying how those compounds change the brain. Thousands of years of experimentation had slowly become a science. But the mystery had never completely disappeared, because the brain itself remained one of the most complicated things human beings had ever tried to understand. And perhaps that is why the history of intoxication never really has a final chapter. Every generation discovers something new about the human mind. Every generation also discovers new ways to influence it. The medieval world used herbs, alcohol, fasting, prayer, and ritual. Later centuries added tobacco, coffee, tea, refined medicines, and concentrated chemicals. Modern science added even more powerful tools. But the basic human questions remained unchanged. Why do we dream? Why do we seek pleasure? Why do we fear losing control? And why can changing the chemistry of the brain sometimes make the world feel completely different? For most of history, people could only describe these experiences. They might say that colors looked brighter. That sound became strange. That time seemed slower. That they felt unusually calm. Or that they had entered a world that seemed almost magical. Today, scientists can explain some of these effects. But explanation does not necessarily make them less mysterious. The human brain remains astonishingly complex. A tiny chemical change can influence emotion, memory, movement, and perception. A substance that seems harmless in one situation can become dangerous in another. A medicine can save a life. The same medicine, used incorrectly, can cause serious harm. That complicated balance has followed humanity from the first herbal healer to the modern laboratory. And perhaps the strangest part is how familiar the ancient stories still feel. People thousands of years ago wanted relief from pain. They wanted better sleep. They wanted energy. They wanted celebration. They wanted spiritual experiences. And sometimes, they simply wanted to forget their troubles. We still do. The names of the substances have changed. The technology has changed. The laws have changed. But the person sitting alone at the end of a difficult day has not changed very much. The desire to feel different remains deeply human. And so, after thousands of years, the search continues. Quietly, curiously, and sometimes dangerously, but always revealing something about the strange, restless creature we call human. As we reach the final chapters of this long history, one thing becomes clear. Intoxication was never just about getting drunk or seeing strange things. It was connected to almost every part of human life. Medicine, religion, trade, vow, work, celebration, and even sleep. People used substances because life itself could be difficult. Pain was unavoidable. Illness was frightening. Work could be exhausting. And sleep did not always come easily. A simple drink or herb could sometimes offer a brief escape. For a few hours, the world might feel softer. The body might become lighter. The mind might become quieter. But the same doorway could lead somewhere dangerous. Too much could mean sickness. Repeated use could become dependence. And what began as relief could eventually become another source of suffering. This contradiction appears again and again throughout history. A substance can help one person and harm another. A plant can be medicine in one context and poison in another. A drink can bring friends together or destroy relationships. The difference is often found in dose, circumstance, and human behavior. Medieval people did not understand these principles in the language of modern science, but they recognized many of the consequences. They knew that excess could be dangerous. They knew that some plants were powerful. They knew that certain mixtures should be handled carefully. And they knew that losing control could have serious consequences. Their explanations were often different from ours, but their observations were sometimes surprisingly accurate. That is why the history of intoxication should not be viewed simply as a collection of strange old beliefs. It is also a record of people trying to understand their bodies and minds with the limited knowledge available to them. They experimented. They made mistakes. They learned. Then they passed that knowledge forward. Thousands of years later, we are still doing the same thing. The tools are better. The explanations are more precise. But the curiosity remains. And perhaps that is the quietest lesson of all. Human beings have always wanted to understand what lies inside their own minds. Sometimes they discovered the answer in a laboratory, sometimes in a monastery garden, and sometimes in a single mysterious plant growing beside an ancient road. There is one final detail worth remembering. The history of intoxicants is also a history of ordinary people. Kings and scholars wrote books. Physicians recorded treatments. Religious leaders created rules. But most people simply live their lives. A farmer might drink ale after working in the fields. A traveler might carry a small herbal remedy. A mother might prepare a traditional medicine for a sick child. A monk might grow plants in a quiet garden. A merchant might transport unfamiliar substances across distant roads. These people rarely imagined that their everyday choices would someday become part of history. Yet they were. Their habits helped shape cultures. Their experiments preserved knowledge. Their mistakes created warnings. And their discoveries traveled from one generation to another. Sometimes that knowledge disappeared and was later rediscovered. Sometimes it was changed almost beyond recognition. A plant once used as medicine could become associated with magic. A drink once considered dangerous could become part of a celebration. A substance once praised by physicians could eventually be restricted by governments. History constantly changed the meaning of these things. But the human body remained the same. We still have brains that respond to chemicals. We still experience pain, pleasure, fear, boredom, curiosity, and exhaustion. And we still search for ways to influence those feelings. Perhaps it is why this story feels surprisingly familiar. The medieval healer looking for a plant to ease suffering was not so different from a modern scientist searching for a new treatment. The tired worker seeking a drink at the end of a difficult day is not so different from someone today looking for a way to relax. The person fascinated by a strange vision is not so different from someone wondering what consciousness really is. Different centuries, different languages, different explanations, but one human experience. And now, as the long story slowly comes to an end, the strange world of ancient herbs, medieval medicines, sacred rituals, and intoxicating drinks begins to fade into the distance. The night becomes quieter, the old roads disappear, and the people who once walked them become shadows in history. But their curiosity remains with us. And so, after thousands of years, our journey finally comes to an end. From ancient fermented drinks to medieval herbs, from cannabis and tobacco to modern medicines, humans have always searched for ways to change how they feel. Sometimes the reason was simple: pain, hunger, exhaustion, fear. Sometimes it was curiosity, sometimes celebration, and sometimes the desire to escape the ordinary world for just a little while. The medieval people we imagine tonight were not so different from us. They did not have laboratories or brain scanners. They did not understand chemistry as we do. But they watched. They experimented. They remembered what worked. They warned others about what went wrong. And they passed their knowledge forward. Some of that knowledge was accurate. Some was mistaken. Some disappeared completely. But together, these small discoveries created a long human story. A story about plants. A story about medicine. A story about pleasure. A story about belief. And ultimately, a story about the mysterious human mind. Perhaps the most fascinating part is that the search never truly ended. Even today, people continue asking the same ancient questions. How can we reduce suffering? How can we sleep? How can we feel better? How can we understand consciousness? And what happens when we change the chemistry of the mind? We may have better answers now, but we still do not understand everything. There are still mysteries inside the human brain. There are still questions about consciousness that science cannot completely explain. And there are still moments when people simply want to step away from the noise of everyday life. So tonight, as this story fades away, you can let those old roads disappear. The medieval villages become quiet. The monastery gardens fall into darkness. The distant markets empty. The travelers stop walking. And the ancient world becomes still. Take a slow breath. Let your shoulders relax. Let your thoughts become quieter. You do not need to solve any of those ancient questions tonight. For now, it is enough simply to rest. And somewhere, centuries ago, another tired person was probably doing exactly the same thing, trying to find a little peace before morning. Good night.